Okay, welcome everybody to the cross-organizational data collaboration meetup. This is meetup number 9, and we're going to go ahead and get started with a little bit of smorgasbord from everybody in the group about their weekly happenings and how that might relate to the topic at hand. So let's go ahead and get started. Who would like to go first? Nobody
Philippe,
shot.
would you like to start?
I don't have anything very specific top of mind at the moment, but of course, there are things coming to mind as we are slowly approaching indifferent towards the cross-organizational collaboration. The reason is that we now have more or less a data product platform in place so that we can manage data products. And the next steps now is to look at data products between organizations. How do we use them to collaborate? So maybe that is a conversation we could have today, really how we collaborate on the same data products so that we have a number of data products and we work with them between organizations to run initiatives together to capture mission control parameters, basically what we're doing together in a data product, one or many. That could be a topic to talk about today, because I believe that is a hard problem in general. Where do we put them? How do we think about them? How do we capture the metadata, the schema, the contents of them? And how do we manage in a knowledge graph all of the access to it? Should we collaborate in a way that we do push and pull so that we have our own version at all times of all of the data and we only collaborate on parts of it? Or do we collaborate on all of it, and how those are some of the thoughts that I have for the coming year, and I'm thinking a lot about.
Philip, when we think about data products, how narrow or general should a person sort of think about that term? Is it a very specific thing, or is it a very general thing, or is it to be defined?
I'm very inspired by Terminus DB, naturally, since I'm working very closely with them. So for me, data product is something that has a schema. It has content in it. It is bounded, which means that it is a specific definition for what goes in it. So in terms of that, is a data product, I believe it has a set of content that makes sense in a specific domain. You don't capture everything in one data product. You have multiple data products, and then you need to think about boundaries for them as well, which is an interesting but hard problem, because if you want to scale, you need to keep it like microservices, but also the microdata for things, probably, because otherwise you cannot scale enough.
And should the schema you speak of have a specific format?
It doesn't really matter for the problem at hand. I believe you need to have a schema that defines your content. Probably that schema could be used elsewhere as well. And probably you wouldn't want to have one ontology taxonomy that defines your space in general, and a little bit probably also the intersections between what you put in different data products. I think that is a fairly open question in general.
Okay. And data products are meant to be sort of transactional then, or shareable or packageable, right? Or I assume the sort of use of the product is meant to imply something that can be packaged, right? Something rather specific in its instance.
Yeah, and I think here's a space that is emerging. So in one way, it could be a package-ready data product, but it could also be a collaboration forum, which means that you have an emergent data product property. That means you create something, but you also invite collaboration in that product. And you could do that with the database as well, if you open it up to the collaborators. So it doesn't have to be in the specific knowledge graph space. It is a general problem, I think, to capture and bind, put a boundary around some data and enable collaboration on it using APIs or any form. So I think it's fairly broad. It's fairly broad in that sense, but you need to have the rules of engagement clarified with everyone. Here is how we engage with this data product.
Mm-hmm. And how would you describe sort of the approach to versioning then of data products in terms of if they're packaged, if they're contained in some sense, then there may be multiple of them that speak to the same problem domain schema, but they're evolving. So how does one sort of approach the versioning of data products tracking?
That is not a very easy one. Looking at what Terminus DB did with full lineage, you have full history of both the schema and the instance data. I believe in that sense they have combined, they have put the two together in terms of schema and instance. I believe they need, based on experience now, I believe they need to have separate versioning so that you version your instance data and your schema data separately, so that you have your version of the schema that you can use in many locations that defines the data. But in terms of that, you need to understand how things evolved.
Yeah, that's a good point. But curious, why the separation in your mind? Why manage those as distinct entities, the instance data and the schema?
Because I believe the schema is interoperable in many instances. You would have entities that you record in multiple data sets, in multiple data products that look the same, that need to look the same, because you want interoperability across data products. And I believe in a world where we have many data products that separate out. So kind of a sharding scheme might be relevant in some very large scale data product ecosystems, where you might have map data, or you back to the environmental data with what we have in terms of water data, etc. That might be sharded per tile on the earth. How much water data do we have in this sector? Because you wouldn't capture everything in one data product. You probably would have numerous, a number of them, where you have only specific tiles that you're interested on for a specific analysis. And there you would want to have the same schema for multiple data products. So you want to version that in one level, but what is the content of a specific data product would be versioned independently. So that is how I think of it. Make sense?
Makes sense. I'm thinking that there are actually tiers of data models, tiers. I'm thinking in ontology terms and also in terms of subgraphs and graphs. And so if you have a shared layer of both instance data and ontologies, they both live in the same place, both can be managed as data, both can be accessed in a fair data way, and you can add to the ontologies periodically as you do with the instance data. And so because we have compute networking and storage now to be able to handle large amounts of data, it's possible to do these things in a way that is fully aggregated, at least when it comes to the shareability of it. And so that was the idea behind linked data, and they've gone through iterations of it. But you know, I think that the challenge has been with linked data that you still have a lack of context, and the context allows connections. So whatever schemas you come up with, there have to be you have to build enough context with relationships in the data to make that possible. And let me just, Andrew, you mentioned some things we might be looking at lately. I was interviewing, last month I was interviewing Tammy Lee, and she's got a company that she's had since 2015 that has worked with arts data in Canada. And so they wandered around trying to develop interoperability between disparate systems for a few years, and then they realized it was just a fool's errand to do it the way they were thinking about doing it. And she had a full technical team working with her. So they ended up adopting the standards-based knowledge graph approach. And so what that implies is a different development model. So you've got the ontologies that provide a lot of the declarative and rule information. The executables are still in applications, but I could show you a graph of their problem if you want, if I can share the screen here.
Yeah, let me go ahead and enable that.
Okay.
Okay, you should be able to grab the screen.
Okay. So are you seeing it now?
Yes.
So the problem that Tammy described was that, and she's got a dance background. She was a director for dancing tours for many years. So the problem that these performing arts groups have is that the events calendar is all over the place. Just like you said, Andrew, it's all siloed. You've got Ticketmaster, you've got the municipalities, you've got the dance companies. How do you bring the calendars together? So Tammy's group knew they needed a way to bring this stuff together. And so when they embarked on the knowledge graph approach, they realized that it was a totally different way of creating applications. And so this is their event ontology simplified. But after they built the knowledge graph for this, they decided that they would try to evangelize and get people to write apps for it. And they started writing their own apps as a way to get things started. So they do have a calendar app that they're using. And this is all funded by Canadian grants. This is purely a nonprofit approach. But what it points out to me is that she's working at a different level, a higher level of abstraction. She is actually working cross-organization in a way that's feasible now. And the challenge then becomes, well, how do you bring people over to create the apps for this kind of approach? So you've solved a bit of one problem, but you haven't solved all the others we've been talking about. And so we're sort of off in left field with this approach because most people are not thinking in this manner. But I do think it holds promise because it eliminates so much duplication to do it this way. As a matter of fact, this sort of federated model sort of eliminates duplication in a lot of ways. So you're being much less wasteful. So I favor this method because it has so many advantages. And I'm just wondering what others think about this kind of approach.
I have an immediate thought that I had throughout, and that is in relation to the data. So we would have here the same schema for your knowledge. The question is if the data has to be co-located so that you could have, what I'm thinking of is a distributed zero copy approach, that you would have a key, sharding key, basically on where the data is located, which means that multiple organizations, like we have with JSON LD on the web, can organize their data in the same way, but have it in multiple locations. So that means that you would interact using the same schema with the graph, but you would have the graph instances in multiple locations, but sharing the same schema. Like you were starting out with, if I understood you correctly, Alan, this was a bit what you were starting. You co-locate the schema with the data, but the schema evolves slowly and the data faster.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that is a fantastic model to collaborate. Question is how, if we can have that kind of a federated model where you have readability across multiple locations, like on the web, and then you can run and write your own copy, or where you have access to write, which means you can have access to all the information. You can have all of the collaboration, but you know the semantics of access.
Exactly, exactly. And you think about that approach by contrast with a generative AI approach, which is, you crawl and spider the web, and you're capturing all this other stuff. And I'm writing a piece now about how many data centers Apple, Microsoft, and Alphabet, Google have, and they're spending upwards of $10 billion a year on data center expansion and upgrades every year now. And so a lot of that is just copied data that they don't quite have permission to use in the way they're using it. So I do think there's a regulatory concern with that approach. And if we can provide an alternative, then it might be more agreeable to the powers that be in the regulatory space.
Alan, how would the generative AI approach in your mind be a counterexample to what we're seeing here, where this is a very intentional shared schema by a group of people? How do you see that differently? Like, how would that be an alternative, I guess? Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of, I'm thinking from a regulatory perspective in terms of personally identifiable information. And so if you're just casting this wide net and scooping up all this stuff like a fishing trawler is, then all sorts of different kinds of fish end up in the net. And maybe some of these are endangered species, and so there's a more controlled approach just by starting with the user, allowing the user to own their own very sensitive, at least the very sensitive personally identifiable info. All the correlatable identifiers, for example, that banks are always asking for. Banks don't have to collect that stuff anymore. We have the technology to just keep those numbers, for example, and other related data on a phone, and then just instead of using numbers, you could just verify, for example, that you're old enough to drive. So the driver's license number is in some sense irrelevant if you can just verify that this person's old enough to drive or take a drink, for example. So basically, I'm looking at the bleeding edge here, and there are people with all these exciting ideas that I get enthusiastic about, and there is a bit of adoption, but it's really hard to uncover, and most people don't know anything about it. So I have another slide that talks about the generations of compute, networking, and storage, and how circuitous the path has been to decentralization. And Andrew and I talked about incremental kinds of changes. We're both sort of frustrated with overly incremental approaches that are sort of random and cause a slowing of the progress technologically. So why not try to take a more direct path to value by bypassing some of these interim approaches and just try to go straight to what we need, given that we have more resources now to do that? That's just a question. And we're the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah. Something comes to mind when you say that, Alan, because there's a blog that I follow. It's Stephen Bailey that he just published. I'll paste it here in the chat. And what he was talking about was, or what the author was talking about, because he has a few authors now that are writing on his blog, or Substack rather, about the insistence of the big players in the industry to put out essentially tool sets that don't work for smaller groups of people. So for instance, all the big data tools that were popular in the past 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of those tool sets that you'll find in, Matt Turk's data map, they just are not relevant for the smaller teams. They become overly consumed. It's really for the bigger players. But likewise, we saw that with Hadoop years back. Everybody wanted to get on that bandwagon, but it was just too much of a beast for most IT departments to even understand it and use it effectively. But we were trying to emulate some of the bigger players. And I think what we need to do is to be able to scale down to zero scale, something that is usable by the individual. So in reverse, what can an individual do and contribute towards the whole? And I think that goes towards what you're saying. Instead of these brute force approaches that are being taken by the biggest players, I think the key lies in how the smaller players effectively collaborate one-on-one using effective tools that can build out to larger solutions, but they start small.
I think I agree. And I'm thinking back to what you said, Alan, and what you brought up as a topic, which really goes back to saying, here is how we, as this small community, express the information, basically the schema. Because if we want to enable cross-organization collaboration, we need to know what we're talking about in good enough sense. And I think a lot of the things that I see in the data space in general is a lot of conversation around how to express the data and what the data is, what it isn't. And it seems it's not that much that we have been lacking compute, but the understanding, and I think it's still lacking in lots of spaces, being able to just express how we express data, the metadata around what we're doing. And that is not easily taught, it seems, because not enough people know how to just express, this is how we'll collaborate on the data. This is what it means. These are the state transitions that happens in it. And here is what we'll do about it. I find that these questions are too seldom asked early on in the process, but very late. And then a lot of things have been built and need to be rebuilt as the understanding emerges, because no one really looked at the problem hard enough in the beginning. I don't know if this resonates. I see some smiles, but I'm thinking how the cross-organizational collaboration brings this even for, we have the cross-site organization within companies. But what the middlemen, the large companies, Google, Apple, everyone, they've provided an ecosystem of collaboration. So they define the data format. We're big enough to say how it should be. So follow our rules or don't. And then everyone kind of goes in that direction. And that is, how do we get the masses to adopt a good enough set that isn't perfect? Because everyone wants perfect, so they're not willing to settle for what is just good enough. So I don't know how we would be thinking about that to get it right, but in order to get back our ownership of data, not copying it around, we need to have it in a good enough form so that we can collaborate. I can send Andrew or Alan or Greg a specific piece of information in a format that you would recognize, and we don't need all of that back and forth of exactly defining it, because there is some authority saying that, well, this is what it means in general, so it will be good enough for the specific situation.
Yes, I think there's now this is an overloading of a term, but there's been a term that's been put out there in the industry they call it dark data, but I'm seeing it in a different way. If you look at like dark matter in space, it's just all the stuff between these subjects of interest, the bodies of interest by astronomers. If they can't really explain it, there is something in data that's like that too. There's these tacit understandings that go on between individuals and groups that never get captured.
Yeah.
And we have the islands, so to speak, that we work on and we focus on. And the afterthought, to your point, Philippe, is that, oh, well, we need a boat to get between these islands. Oh, well, let's just go ahead and construct that as an afterthought. We never think to capture all that knowledge that happens between the islands. And that's the fundamental issue, I think, that we have. We don't necessarily need more databases or different kinds of data, but we do need some kind of layer that captures that ether between the two without trying to sound too abstract. We
Yeah.
just do that.
And I think that is something that has been, I mean, the big analytics, the successful analytics, I think, managed this in most of the cases to get it good enough for the moment, then be opening up enough for being able to fix it in the future. What wasn't there.
And maybe what's missing here, or at least one of the things that's missing, is a new stratum of the inter-organization, where you've got resources and people who are engaged at this stratum who share more broadly the inner workings, so that you're not reinventing the wheel. And I think that if you think about Blue Sky, for example, Jack Dorsey's social media product that's P2P, what he's envisioning, he and his team are envisioning, is interoperability between social networking silos. And that's all well and good, but you've still got a centralization in Blue Sky. So if you had an alternative where this new stratum of activity and development really works for the good of the collective, the consortium, let's say, then you'd be less incremental in how things are changing. And so the challenge from the VC perspective, of course, is how do you monetize that stratum? And governments are usually pretty slow at taking these sorts of approaches, but I do think there's an organizational change element here that keeps holding us in the past.
I think you brought up a very important point, and something that was on my mind in the week or so, and that is a different take. So I will be switching subject, and we can come back to the original one if this is bollocks. The thought that I had was, in the past, 50, 100 years ago, we had the public squares, we had the streets between all of the shops and the parking when we had cars, and we had to walk those public utilities that were paved, that were handled in a good way, so that everything could actually communicate in a good way. So we had the scaffolding of society built by society. What we have now is, so in the beginning as well, we had the railroad tycoons that built their things. Eventually, we saw the public utility of all of these things and ensured that they were properly managed. But we haven't done that with the digital space, and it's been ongoing for a very long time. And I think that the scaffolding between the shops, the individuals that go shopping, and everyone involved would be translatable to the internet space as well. For the cross-organizational collaboration, we need the ether for it to work. The physical infrastructure, or not the physical, the logical infrastructure out there. And I think that is a large part of what we're talking about in this space, is that we don't want the streets, the squares, and the malls being completely monopolized by these big few, but rather something that we have together.
Yes. Digital self-assembly. I think that's what.
And I think that ether needs to be more properly defined. And I've been seeing the reasons for having more of government and intergovernment, inter-country collaboration for this space as a very important part that we haven't had.
Yeah. One of the things I was talking about with a colleague of mine yesterday was one of the characteristics I see is advantageous is to have local autonomy but global visibility. I think that's important, because you can have a small group of folks collaborate, but then that becomes a silo. They can find ways, but they need to be both globally visible but have local autonomy over their local public square, as you call it, and not have to rely on a third party to have the square. They should be able to self-assemble and do that. I think those are two key characteristics that enable a healthier environment for collaboration. And there are some examples of that today. They're just emerging, though. It's not the norm. The norm is large tech companies acting as the toll booth.
And they
that
charge for
local,
it.
I guess, Andrew, I'd kind of push back a little bit on the local autonomy is part of the problem, because the result is it leads in non-conformity of the solutions built, right? So there's nothing that links one local team's approach to solving the problem that their result is going to be interoperable or anything like somebody else's local approach. And so even global visibility, you sure, if you care to know what they're doing, you can see what they did or how they did it, but there's nothing that guarantees that to use the infrastructure, sort of Philip's bringing up, are the pipes that this set of drain system uses compatible with the pipes in their next contingent neighborhood's pipes, right? There's nothing that they just decided, hey, we're going to go with this vendor, we're going to do it this way, this is how we're going to design it. Not interoperable. So where do you get the actual sort of the collaboration between communities that you need if you don't have any ability to enforce sort of what they do autonomously at the local level?
Yeah, I actually was thinking about that as well. And I think the global visibility, it doesn't completely solve it, but in part does. I'll give an example. I noticed something on TikTok, my kids show me what's happening there. One of the funny things about TikTok, these mostly kids are creating content for consumption by their peers across the country. And one of the strange things I've found is that no matter where they lived in the country, they all had the same strange accent. And and that didn't used to be the case. When we were growing up in different parts of the country, we spoke differently. We were isolated. But these kids all adopt, whether they live in the South or the West Coast. And I looked it up, and it's a phenomenon. They call it the vocal fry, and you can check that out. But they purposely or unintentionally change how they speak when they publish content, so they can get better visibility, so they can have like this uniform way to deliver whatever message they're trying to deliver. I thought that was an interesting phenomenon, and that's largely because they can see each other and they want each other to understand each other. So whether they're from the deep South or from the Pacific Northwest, they all seem to either knowingly or unknowingly adopt this like generic American or North American accent. It's strange, but it speaks to how visibility across communities end up with this kind of homogenous adoption of things. I think that phenomenon very well could play out in the digital knowledge world as well. I could be wrong, but I think that visibility does provide that, even if you have local community. Because when they get off TikTok, I'm sure they're back to however they speak, their colloquialisms and everything. But they seem to drop all the colloquialisms when they talk, which is interesting.
And it seems like there is a conformity that's sort of born of a competitive environment, right? That everyone's playing the same game, so there's a common set of rules or rules of engagement, right? How you talk when you're trying to make a good TikTok, because it is competitive, right? Because there is this global competition that drives the conformity, or so what success is going to look like becomes defined through everyone's mutual experience. But again, it does. But sort of where does novelty come from then too? Because you need to sometimes do something different to be original, right? Or to offer something of value to that platform. So I don't know, Alan, maybe you had a thought on that too. Something.
Yeah, well, back when I was at PwC, we did a report on gamification, and that term was just starting to be used, and I do think there is there are lots and lots of different uses for different kinds of gamification. And where it's been most prominent, of course, is in reinforcing the power of the LinkedIns, for example, and the Facebooks, et cetera. But you know, if you have it in a sort of municipal public kind of space, and you were trying to incentivize collective behavior with those techniques, then it'd be interesting to see what you could come up with along the lines of what you're describing, Greg. So I think part of the problem we have in the US, Philippe, is that we've lost faith in our governments in a lot of ways, and there's no alternative emerging that really fills in the gaps. So maybe we have to go back to the town square and the town meetings, et cetera, and just do it virtually rather than geographically.
But I see a movement in general that's slowly emerging. It doesn't so far go that fast, but we're talking a lot about it, where we have this, in a way, deglobalization. But I think it's not only in the trade pattern. I think it's in general that we're looking for there is a new tribalism that is growing in a way, and I think that is where we are going with this space as well. And to facilitate, going back to the TikTok, I think that was a great input that fuels the thoughts in this area as well, because I think that the simple mechanisms are important. So I was meshing together with what you said a few episodes in some ago, Alan, in some other forum, and having the ability to have enough stability to collect events in a format that you can recognize and do something with, so that you have this zero copy integration of sorts in a federated, distributed way, where you have the stability enough to know that this resource that I'm using is likely to remain. Because at the moment, everything is ephemeral. Everywhere on the internet, what we see is there for a short amount of while. There are very few structures that pass the test of time. And I think that we need simpler, more lasting mechanisms that don't draw that much of power, that are simple, elegant, and that have this event-based property of distribution of information, or at least collection in some relevant points. So those are a few things that I'm drawing into this conversation for creating such a collaborative space for the crossover.
Does an example come to mind, Philippe, for this event-based mentality?
Some of that I'm currently exploring, as I think Andrew is also, the WASM space. So I was looking at something called WASM Cloud, where you really go down into very small microservices that can collaborate locally. But since they're untrusted, you would be able to have the same mechanisms at scale in many locations that would be able to interact with the same data in the same way if we had the necessary patterns for collaboration. We have more of a message-orientated collaboration, so that the events can be distributed at scale and be stable. And I don't know how that separates into small domains that you can kind of subscribe to, but I would see that we would have the ability to have local clusters of things, so that the ether itself could be created out of WASM in a way, because it's interoperable, it's standardized, we know how it works. It doesn't depend on a specific kind of compute technology, because it runs more or less on any compute technology. So that would solve the network, compute, storage more or less. The storage is not really defined in the WASM space, in that we would need the necessary protocol for having persistence. But putting those pieces together, data products, knowledge graphs, bounded areas, the solid pods, I think that we might see something emerging there.
Yeah. And I think that's a good counter, kind of a pushback to cloud in a sense, because all the utilities and services. Well, in order for us to interact with them, we have to be in somebody else's sandbox. We have to learn how they do things. WASM allows the individual to go back to the individual to be able to construct, logic along with their data set, and it runs anywhere, including the smallest of devices. That pushes power back to the edges. And I think that's what's important about it. You don't have to have like this large framework that is controlled by AWS or something else. You have the ability to have nano services anywhere, including the smallest of devices. So I think that's, very interested in that as well.
And I think that we might have something that is similar to the power utilities that are there. We expect them to work in a certain way. It gives voltage and it gives you amps to a certain degree. And multiple companies can provide the same thing with the same protocols. And that means that you have the choice, you know what is there. And maybe this is something akin to the railroad parts. We create standards because we need them so that we can work on smaller scale. And I think back to the individual again, I think Andrew or Alan, I don't remember, or if it was you, Greg, going back to the individual is important, that we can express things at any scale, from local to very big.
Common accent, to go back to the TikTok.
Sorry, how?
A common accent, to go back to the TikTok example.
Yes,
so we can understand each other, because we want to push our our ideas, our content.
There's still a large
piece. Curious how deep that needs to go, right? I mean, I'm obviously a thinker that it needs to go very deep in terms of not just the structure of the language, but the structure of structure, right? Structure of structures from which you would derive a language, right? The grammar, vocabulary, syntax level of thinking versus the English versus Spanish level of thinking, right? Or the YAML versus JSON, or linked data versus relational. I think that if you're, and where things get difficult is in these format transformations, right? And I think it's easy to talk about data as if it's this sort of homomorphous thing, but it's not. It's very heterogeneous, and you can't just brush that off, because that's where all the work is, right? In the transformation of format. And none of that really cares what language you're speaking, whether it's English, Spanish, or SQL, right? And so I really am a strong believer that abstraction has to go all the way down to both the structures of information and the logic of information, the logic of language, in order to truly find interoperability. And otherwise, I mean, I would say, yes, there are the human element challenges, right? There are organizational challenges, the change management challenges. But if you haven't solved, like, actually at the end of the day, how are we technically going to unify our understanding of information, we'll always have a Tower of Babel, right? Because we'll always be trying to, pick the language we're going to speak and sort of get everyone to conform to that. And that's really hard, right? There's a lot of work in that. So I see there's two issues. There's a human element, and there's also still this sort of technical, the format, the shape of the data matters. And we can't just sort of assume that because it's data, everyone will have access to it, right? Or access would even matter, right? If they did have access, it would even matter if it wasn't in the right format.
Right. You're absolutely right. But I think that's where you come in, Greg. Honestly, that's the ultimate goal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. When you're talking, Greg, I'm thinking about role and reference grammar, RRG.
Sure.
And I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's
yes, I'm familiar with it. Yep.
Somewhat proprietary, and their claim is in some ways similar, because they talk about being cross-language. They're stepping back from foreign language distinctions, and in that sense, they're abstracting more the way you are. What's your impression of that approach?
My impression overall is it's linguistic.
Yeah.
And so there are ontological commitments, if you will, to how we're going to model language. And I think from when most people are exposed to it, they see the complexity of it, and it becomes overwhelming. So there's a type of complexity that's sort of like linguists, when they analyze language, like how you analyze a language, right, matters. And you're trying to advocate for a standard means of understanding the model of language. But those commitments can become quickly isolating, and sort of you've just created a new Tower of Babel, right? Because it sort of requires everyone to conform to that understanding of how we're going to parse language or how we're going to understand language. And it's always so subtle. I mean, the beauty of language is its ambiguity, right? That the fact that you can say very little physically or written and have an audience that will actually understand what you say, because they can bring all this context to bear to their interpretation of what you've said, right? But when you try to get down into details and say, well, we're gonna make this clear by following a linguistic method to make everything explicit, right? You're expanding out what's being said well beyond sort of what was actually said, right? You're trying to get so specific in your analysis that you've hammered out every detail, right? But at some point, you don't even know what's the justification for that interpretation. Like, are those details really what the person meant, or are we just, and how would you know? So if what I just said sounds confusing, because like, I think that's my overall impression, is that linguistics is confusing, right? And it becomes a matter of interpretation, and there's no way to know which is the right interpretation, because something's lost between speaker and hearer, right? So yeah, I see it as like really sophisticated technical stuff, but I also see it maybe as that's going to be its biggest challenge to adoption, or as a way forward, is because you'll immediately get into the weeds in terms of arguments of what people really mean, right? And I think that's problematic in terms of a solution, right? And what's, I mean, I guess if I just sort of leveled a criticism there, like, what do I see as the alternative, right? It has to be something simpler and something that is not open to debate, right? And so you need to ground interpretation in something that will people can always point to and say exactly what that means. To me, it's abstract pattern is the answer to that. A finite system of pattern that we can all agree on what it means, because we've defined exactly why it means what it means. It means nothing more, nothing less, and we can all agree on that, right? That seems to be the basis to approach an interpretation method, versus sort of getting lost in the words and the meaning of words, and that's sort of where linguistics gets stuck. So,
yeah, and I think Brett Forbes talks about type DB, and the types that are in type DB are sort of summarizing, if you will, each a different pattern. So they're suggesting a pattern.
Yeah, but I would always say pattern has to be something finite, right? It can be infinite through expression, but you have to have a finite set of rules, and the fewer the better. Honestly, I think there's a lot of power in iteration, but I think if it's not fixed and finite in terms of where it starts, and you can arbitrarily add things that you need as you go along, that's when you know you're going down the wrong path. If you're having to sort of create new types to address new situations, right?
I'm unsure. I can see. I'd like to offer a thought here, which is that to define things specifically, we need to know them, and most of the times we don't know enough to express it well enough. So we have this ability in humans that is kind of unique, which we don't have in the digital form, which is to say, I don't know, but it's approximately here. And we have the same thing in language as well, where we can express things with very wide word frames, where things could mean many things. And then we can become much more fine-grained with advanced language. So as we learn language, we manage to learn things more and more fine-grained. We can express things with more and more specificity, but we're never getting completely exact with language. And that is so interesting. So the Germans have more specific words than English in general for many things that are mechanical. So when you express things mechanically in English, you will get less precision than the Germans do, if I understand that concept of so these word frames are really important in linguistics. And the reason I bring this up is that I believe that if we would have the same kind of reasoning around uncertainty of what things mean, not of what they are, but what they mean, we would be able to have this multi-layered approach to knowledge, which I feel we are lacking in a way in how we express things in system. We expect everyone to know, and if they don't know, it's wrong. It's not along a continuum, but it is either right or wrong. And by having the explicit expectation that things needs to be very specific, that is great in when you need to know it. But when you don't, we have a hard time. And I think that is also why the cross-organizational collaboration, because we don't have these frames of reference that you would have in an enterprise, becomes so hard.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the multi-layered approach to adding specificity, as language does, is a great way to do it. I think where that falls apart is we're not specific enough about our ambiguity.
Yeah.
Right? You need to be explicitly say, I am not saying anything specific right now.
Yeah.
That has to mean something, right? I am being intentionally ambiguous here. And that gives license to this may mean any number of things. He actually didn't say what he meant, right?
Yeah.
And are we explicit about that? Or do we always try to fill in the blank, right? We always look at it as like an ad lib where we're like, oh, we got to fill in all the blanks in our lines so that we get like a real story here. And I think you're absolutely right. But what that requires is an enforcement of ambiguity.
Yeah.
You didn't say what you meant. You didn't get specific enough to express something. And if at those lower, higher levels, whatever, the more general layers, you can actually enforce ambiguity, then you can always go back and add the specificity later. And language, speaking more, right, will do that.
The question is how we build the necessary scaffolding or building blocks for such a knowledge representation. Because if we would get the compute, the networking more or less defined, hopefully storage as well, but storage entails knowing what we store. So if we would manage to get the building blocks for expressing knowledge in this multi-dimensional way that has more or less ambiguity. I'm thinking in risk, you can take confidence interval. If they're wider, you have less specificity in terms of what you know. And if it's wide, if it's narrower, you know more specifically a specific number. You would have a normal distribution there. But that is just for very specific numbers that you could use that kind of a pattern. I'm thinking, how would we be able to use a similar pattern in other spaces? That's very hard.
So I think one thing is that you need that fixed system of representation has to represent both data structure and language, right? So when you go to put the content in, you need to not have changed your approach to when you decided how you're going to structure that content. So I think that's a really important point there. I wanted to say something else, but I forgot what it was.
Well, it just occurs to me, and maybe I could help link us back to what we were talking about earlier with the individual, Greg. Since you're talking about more generalized patterns to begin with, and that's sort of the foundation, maybe at an individual level, you can use more generalisms to at least work at an individual level. It's just a hypothesis.
Yeah, I guess so. The other point, thank you, Alan, you reminded me here, was to have ambiguity in the chosen structure as well. And let me provide an example. So if you just gave someone a spreadsheet and gave them some task, and they just started dropping values in cells, right? And created their own ad hoc schema, right? They were, say it's a shopping list, right? And so they're going to put things I need, and then willy-nilly just filling in boxes on a spreadsheet, right? So you have to ask yourself, like, in what sense did that person mean anything by the structure? Like, did they actually order those elements on the shopping list by some order they were going to go to the stores? Right? Would they group them into, hey, this is a grocery list and that's a Home Depot list, right? You might put those on separate sheets. So the point is that you can't predict how a person ever uses a data structure, right? And if you like expect them to have implied some meaning in how they use the table, for instance, you can get burned when they depart from that. So what the approach means, you need to be able to basically burn up the structure, right? Burn away the structure, somehow just get the content and then reformat it into some other structure that becomes meaningful. And this is what someone might do by dragging and dropping, a list of items to actually create something that looks like a structured list then, right? So the point is that whatever your approach is has to have this other feature of, I can burn down the structure and rebuild it. I can juggle up the content by filter and sort and arrange such that one structure I used to have meant something, but this new version of the structure means something else. And so the emerging meaning or lack of meaning in structure, I think, is the other feature that is important to have if we're going to sort of achieve interoperability. Because it either has to mean something or it can not mean something. You can have ambiguity in structure, right? And know when you're being ambiguous about the structure you've chosen and when you're not. And I think you find users that force data into structures arbitrarily, right? And then that creates problems. Did you mean to use a triple that way, or should you use the triple this way, right?
I think the content evolution in the way that you express it, I really like how you express it, means that we have a malleable form that we normally don't have, that enables us to express things later and learn from what we did and iterate it in a better way and capture those iterations if we can do that with lineage. So
I love that learning. I mean, it is the with the lineage of learning, if you will. Like if you randomly wrote down a such of items on a page and then you started grouping them and sorting them by, this is my grocery shopping list and that's my Home Depot list, right? Is that not learning? I mean, I love that because it is, in a sense, that's the human in the loop organizing random content into something of meaningful structure. And we do need to track that lineage. We do need to understand how that is a process.
I think it's an important facet of this where we actually add on to our normal abilities, where we can make this learning expressive and we capture it. And I think capturing those building blocks of how knowledge is built at the fundamental level is important to be able to construct the ways to interact at scale. And having those basic building blocks, saying, knowing engineers in general, usually if you give them more constraints, you'll get a better result faster. And in a way, I think that here, finding the relevant and good constraints for something for interoperability would help, where we say, these are the constructs that we have. And most of the case, we would be able to get along, like TikTok. I really like that through in of TikTok, because in a way, that is what we're missing, the ability to evolve in a way. We usually have to specify everything up front in order for it to even work. But being able to slowly iterate in a direction where we find that, well, this is a way that it actually worked, and then, oh, but we're changing it slightly, let's have it this way instead. But if you can capture that lineage, Greg, as you were expressing it, then suddenly we can do that transformation over time.
Yeah, and do it without changing your toolbox too. I think is the other key thing, right? That's what interoperable means, is that. And I think the toolbox for TikTok is just video format, right? Of limited seconds, right?
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of ways you can do that. There are all kinds of things you can do within that format. But all they focused on was standardizing, hey, we're showing videos, right? And then people go at it in terms of the creativity comes within that constraint. And so it's picking the right constraints. I mean, I like your example of engineers too there. It's like, yeah, constraints are helpful because they sort of give you the parameters by which you can do something productive and have a predictable result, right? Like people are going to shoot videos, right? Like that's all we're going to say, right?
Yeah.
Say that and nothing more.
Speaking of constraints in TikTok, what I heard about a about why people like TikTok more than say Instagram is that I guess there's a time limit. And so they really have to pack in like how to make a stir fry or whatever. And people who are busy, they have to go on with their day. They'd rather go to TikTok because they know it's only going to last so long and they get what they need and they get out and they're done. So that's an example of a constraint that's actually useful because it forces the content creator to really summarize quickly and effectively what they want, what they're trying to convey.
That's a really good point. And I was thinking, Greg was talking about intent as well, and having the intent explicit, and it could be tribalized in the TikTok case. So you've got these little tribes and communities that are being created, and if there's an explicit intent expressed that captures the distinctions between tribes, then that could get to the kind of articulation you may be referring to, Greg. Uri talks about fleshing out intent in this open collaboration scheme IndieWeb that he's been developing. And I just think design with intent in mind, just maybe Andrew, the intents are the dark spaces between the islands.
Greg and everybody else, this is kind of out there, but I came across this last week. Speaking of like communicating without the ambiguity, there's an article that discusses these researchers are using AI to read the brainwave patterns of people, and then not guessing, but looking at those patterns and then reconstructing what they're thinking about in terms of images. And it's been somewhat effective. So you get two people and then they think of a cat, and I guess in some cases it's successful. It actually renders a picture of a cat. So that's pure thought based on patterns. I don't know how real this is or not, but I mean, that is using communication without language. And if it's true that multiple people can think of a cat image in their head and it renders relatively the same thing, that is consistency beyond language, isn't it? That those are looking at patterns. What do you make of that? What would that look like 100 years from now? Are we going to just abandon language and just think about things and there's no ambiguity? It's crazy.
I think it's interesting if you look that do visual images actually map to brain structure, right? Is there actually a pattern electrically happening on the surface of the brain that can be detected that corresponds to what we see? And does every brain do that the same way? So I guess those sort of observations or those studies are trying to sort of say there is some at least consistent way from brain A to brain B in which it is handling its processing of visual information, and that's something that we can measure now. It's an interesting question. How similar and how different is one brain from another in terms of how it does that, right? Yeah. And is there something useful that we can sort of measure then by looking at brains in the future?
By the way, we have the interesting question: what is thought and what is communications in the end? Which becomes something very different in terms of, because we'll have all of the symbolism to help us express things, and intent comes into it. I think that's an important part.
Yeah, I've been reading some in logic and language. Sort of, there's this debate as to is deductive reasoning even where does it come from? Where does it live? Is it actually a real thing? I mean, so if you go back to mid-19th century, as people were thinking of modeling logic, they thought that they were modeling how human being or how the brain works, right? And I think a lot of that has been sort of abandoned. I'm not sure quite what has replaced it in terms of modern theories of neuroscience and trying to sort of, a lot of AI researchers will say that, we're trying to model how the brain works. But even something of deductive reasoning where the evidence seems to break down that human beings don't actually function very well deductively, right? We seem to be using a different method of our reasoning processes. And And it's maybe a good conversation for another day in terms of what actually is going on up there. And does it actually have anything to do with what AI researchers are doing today? Or is it just a nice narrative to sort of the way we think about it? It's sort of a nice heuristic, but we don't really know if that's how we think. I'm sort of very doubtful that we are crunching the numbers up there either, that we're doing statistical calculations or little Bayesian networks up there actually guiding our decision making. Because I don't think it's a calculator either. I don't think it's like that adept at like doing mathematical calculations. Otherwise, you could give me a really complex math problem. I would just solve it like that because intuitively my brain would be doing mathematics all the time, right? But I don't think that's how it works. So anyway,
another brought up quantum. Some people think it's a quantum computer in the end.
We don't know what it is.
Well entangled, things are happening across.
I've heard that before. It makes you wonder because it's like you're getting thought beyond yourself, beyond the island. In other words, there's an affinity between sentient beings. It sounds wild, but
spooky action at a distance. Are you talking about?
Yeah, well, yeah, that we conjured knowledge from outside our own brain. And this is all anecdotal, but there was a article I read that talked about folks that had this flashes of insight, and they attributed that they got it from somewhere else outside of themselves. That's a very common interpretation for people that have kind of made leaps and bounds in human progress. Many of them say that. Now, what do you make of it? I don't know, but it's odd that many of them will say that they got it from beyond themselves. I think Tesla attributed some of his stuff to that kind of phenomenon. I don't, this is now this is all crazy talk, but it's odd. Maybe it's not necessarily just in the brain. Maybe we're networked at a quantum level.
Yeah.
I've watched a lot of music documentaries lately, and it seems to be a common theme of songwriters that they often feel like they're channeling something from somewhere else, right? And so when they're in the flow or whatever, and they're songwriting, either the melody or the lyrics just kind of flow. The best songs just sort of come to them in that short period of time, and that's whether it's scientific insights or sort of creative endeavors. I think that's whether it's true or not, we certainly enjoy that. There's something really fascinating and gratifying about that flow state in which things seem to come from beyond.
Exactly. Philip K. Dick said that he was basically just channeling other multiverse dimensions when he wrote his books. These were other realities that he just wrote about them. It's like he was watching TV. That's wild, but he said that.
Just receive it.
Yeah, he's just a receiver. It wasn't necessarily his imagination. He was watching it.
There's a bestseller out on the New York Times list now that is written by can't remember the guy's name, but he's been a producer of sorts for decades now, and so it's about the act of creativity, this book. And basically what this guy tries to do with his artists who are clients is to get them to channel what's in the ether. And I always thought Bob Dylan, for example, was so expressive and creative because he was channeling folk music from decades ago, and then what was happening at that point in his life. So the creative act in Rick Rubin's is his name, I think, in Rick's mind, is a channeling act. It's not a personal thing. It's you're channeling from the ether where everybody is.
Fascinating.
So, and Dylan used to say, I don't know where I came up with this stuff. I don't recognize what I came up with 50 years ago. So if you can't recognize it after you put it down on paper, then you know that you're channeling, or you're just screwing up.
I think they call that personality trait openness. Kind of that willingness to receive stuff.
Yeah, that's right. You got to put your tinfoil hat on.
And the tinfoil hat, yes.
No, but it's interesting how what happens in flow when you're really releasing or opening all of the hashes, all of the channels, and you just start working, and things are just happening in a way. It's no effort. It just happens. You just kind of wired to everything around you, and you know so much more than you do in regular situations. It's interesting.
And then there's another phenomenon that there's another recent article that came out. There's a lot of study now on the effect of psychedelic drugs on the brain, and what they're seeing in the scans now that they put somebody, under, they have them ingest DMT or psilocybin, and what they're seeing in the brain is that these parts of the brain that normally never talk to one another in a way, it's just like a free for all. And so these different regions of brains are connecting to one another. That may be the insight. Maybe flow state is just maybe a mild version of that, that these connections. And it's not uncommon for artists to use psychedelic drugs to get insight, right? That's well known. So it makes you wonder, is it just like this massive connectivity between different parts of the brain as well that produce like new ways of thinking about things that ordinarily were off limits in the control brain? So
there is some the Flow Research Collective with Stephen Kotler has quite a lot of interesting things around decoding the flow states, both on group level and individual level. That could be relevant to check out.
Who is that?
who is it?
Stephen Kotler of the Flow Research Collective. So they're running a program called Zero to Dangerous and a few other things as well.
Check that out. Looks like how about we call it a day?
Yeah.
I think we go in for an hour and a half. By the way, Alan took some very good notes, so I'm going to be sure to take the transcripts and send them out to everybody, because Zoom records that. So he took some pretty good notes. Thanks, Alan.
Sure.
And I'll send that out to everybody in the group. Another good conversation. Never know where it's going to end. This is this is interesting to say the least.
Indeed.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. See you soon.